High above the Soviet Union, Francis Gary Powers is executing what by 1960 had become an almost routine mission for the CIA, flying over the highly sensitive areas of the secretive Communist Empire, gathering critical reconnaissance photographs. At this time in the Cold War, 90% of photographic data on Soviet projects, including their expanding tank and missile programs, was being generated by the aircraft that Powers was operating. An aircraft that on every official channel didn't exist. On the Soviet worker's holiday, his highly classified spy plane would take him from Pakistan to Norway, the same route taken by another of the same aircraft just weeks before. The weather was good, the aircraft had a proven track record, and the enemy had his guard down. But then Powers found his aircraft without its back end and spiraling towards the ground just outside of Sverdlovsk. Captured along with his aircraft and paraded around the Soviet Union soon thereafter, the shoot-down of Francis Gary Powers would set off an international crisis between the two nuclear superpowers of the day. And at the center of it all was the spy plane the US had denied existing for years, the U-2 Dragon Lady. Developed by the equally as mysterious Skunk Works division of Lockheed Aircraft using CIA contingency funds, the U-2 was meant to fly above the ceiling of the Soviets' missile defenses and interceptors. Yet before even the first operational flight of the aircraft, everyone involved in its creation knew that the Dragon Lady was living on borrowed time. So what prompted the U-2's development? How did it affect the delicate balance of the Cold War? And why was the Dragon Lady destined to fail? The end of World War II was, well, messy to say the least. Much of Europe, Africa, and Asia lay in ruins, 3% of the world's population lay dead, and the old empires of Britain and France were crumbling as the new superpowers on the block began rapidly growing in power and capability. In the case of the United States, this would manifest in the form of funding the reconstruction of Europe while using the CIA to quell any communist sentiments there, and the creation of nuclear weapons. And in the case of the Soviet Union, this would manifest in the form of claiming all of Eastern Europe as theirs to create a communist buffer zone, and the creation of nuclear weapons. Those little nuclear devices were a big problem though, because if tensions got too hot between the US and the Soviets, everyone would pay the price. So instead, the two superpowers looked to less confrontational means to evaluate and combat their opponent. For the first few years under President Harry Truman, the US would adopt the Truman Doctrine, supplying aid to any country threatened by communism, but when Eisenhower was elected, being the big dick general he was, he opted to step up the US's game when it came to dealing with those damned commies. Luckily for Eisenhower, by mid-1952, US Air Force Major John Seaberg had a brilliant idea. The Soviet air defenses, as advanced as they may have been for the 1950s, had a ceiling. So what if we made a plane that flew above that ceiling to take reconnaissance photographs or even bomb them? Once the supposedly weak on communism Truman was out and based commie hater Ike was in, Seaberg's ideas gained traction within the new administration, and coupled with an increasing need to peer over the Iron Curtain, a request for proposals for a 60,000-foot capable aircraft was sent out to a number of small aircraft corporations in March 1953, designated the MX-2147 Bold Eagle project, because it ain't a real defense program unless it's got a goofy-ass name. The Air Force felt at the time that the smaller aircraft corporations they were contracting for the project, Bell, Fairchild, and Martin, would prioritize the project more than the titans of the industry, and by 1954, though the Martin RB-57D was showing the most promise, it was characteristically bogged down in copious delays. Kelly Johnson, the legendary head of Lockheed's Skunk Works division, decided he'd had enough of watching the Bold Eagle program flounder, and submitted his own design to Seaberg in May 1954. A heavily modified F-104 starfighter with no landing gear, a new wing design, and a fuselage that had been reinforced and shortened, named the CL-282. Derived from a high-altitude variant of the F-104 and its accompanying design studies for high-altitude flight, the CL-282 offered an aircraft with critical design research already done and from a proven manufacturer. So it only made sense when it was subsequently rejected 3 weeks later. Normally, the story would end there, but Kelly Johnson wasn't one to let other people tell him what to do, and even less so if those people were in the Pentagon. Instead, the Skunks began rapidly redesigning the CL-282, while Johnson pursued funding through other means. And by other means, I mean harassing Philip Strong and Richard Amory of the CIA enough that they caved and took on the project in November 1954. Continued under strict secrecy, the Lockheed project, as many things tend to do in the military, immediately caused an argument. For one, it would take Johnson a number of sleepless nights and several heated exchanges with the government to just get the engineers he needed on the project. The secretive nature of the aircraft placing massive bureaucratic restrictions on security clearances, among other things. The more pressing concerns came from Martin Aircraft and the Air Force. The Lockheed CL-282 threatened the longevity of the already funded RB-57D, as well as the whole high-altitude reconnaissance program already being on the clock, so to speak. But we'll come back to that second point in a minute. After another lengthy argument between the heads of the government panel in charge of the project in early December 1954, the proponents of Lockheed's design won out, with the CL-282 being recommended to President Eisenhower, who would approve the project almost immediately. With the project's approval under the code name Aquatone, the cover story for the new aircraft was written. The Lockheed Bird was a high-altitude research testbed for NASA, and that's NASA with a C, which then becomes NASA with an S in 1958. Skunk Works would receive $54 million in CIA contingency funds, an order for 20 aircraft, responsibility for all future maintenance, and 8 months to get it all done. A daunting task, but certainly one the Skunks weren't going to back down from. Now, before I continue, I need to address the SAM site-shaped elephant in the room, the Soviet missile ceiling. You see, the Soviet S-25 missile was pretty alright for the 1950s, but it could only hit targets at a maximum height of 45,000 feet. And Seeberg's idea really was just to build a plane that went a little bit higher than that. But as much as I would love to call the US military stupid for assuming the Soviets wouldn't just build missiles with greater maximum altitudes, they knew this from the very beginning. In fact, the US's own SAM program was capable of reaching beyond the 60,000 feet Seeberg proposed. Something people seem to forget about the early years of the Cold War is that the West had almost no intelligence on what the Soviets were really up to, and the intelligence they did have suggested that the West was falling behind the commies at a terrifying rate. Seeberg had noticed a potential weak link in the fence that could be exploited only until the Soviets got around to patching it up, so the Bold Eagle project had to be in operation and gathering intelligence fast before someone in Moscow could order the creation of something advanced enough to shoot it down. The approval of the Lockheed design almost 2 years after the rest of the Bold Eagle program meant they may have even less time to gather intelligence if any of the aircraft even made it into service at all. As it turns out, however, this risky move would prove to be one more than worth taking for the Americans, but they knew even before the first aircraft left the ground that their spy plane was living on borrowed time. Back at the Skunk Works, Johnson finally got the government to fuck off and had his team by mid-December, consisting of 25 engineers and 81 shop personnel, including veterans of previous Skunk Works projects and one Ben Rich, a Lockheed thermodynamicist and a newcomer to the Skunk Works, who would later head the division and lead the development of the F-117A Nighthawk. This capable group got to work as fast as they could, Rich later saying they were spurred on by Cold War paranoia, along with a patriotic desire to get an edge on the Soviets in an era when the commies arguably appeared strongest. And soon Project Aquatone was in full swing at the Skunk Works. The majority of the Skunk spent December of 1954 meticulously refining the CL-282 design, and by January, the parts for the first aircraft were being fabricated in the Burbank-based aircraft manufacturer, with much of the tooling carried over from the F-104 to expedite the process. As 1955 progressed, the CIA, using the Air Force as a front, supplied a number of aircraft parts, including the J-57 engines, to the Skunks, who were using the name C&J Engineering, a play on Johnson's government name. But this aroused suspicion from a local postmaster who couldn't find a C&J Engineering listed as a business anywhere in town. So one night, this postmaster had someone follow the shipments to their destination, where the over-curious man was quickly apprehended as a suspected Soviet spy and forced to sign national security secrecy forms until the sun came up. The issue would soon pass, though arousing suspicion from civilians was the least of their worries, as the Aquatone aircraft was plagued with problems throughout its development, many stemming from its big fuck-off wings and the performance of its engines. Though by July 1955, after extensive engine modifications, a brand new kerosene fuel, a lot of praying that the wings wouldn't snap off, and Kelly Johnson almost dying in a car crash, the first flight-capable Aquatone aircraft, creatively named Article 341, would be nearly ready for its first flight. The thing is, where do you test a highly classified aircraft that technically doesn't exist? Luckily, the CIA had thought of this, and in April 1955 had given Lockheed test pilot Tony Levier an aircraft and some fuel, and told him to go find a place in the middle of nowhere for the government to test classified planes. After flying around the west coast, Levier crossed into the Nevada desert, landing on Groom Lake, a dry lake bed adjacent to the Nevada nuclear testing grounds. And a few days later, Johnson and a CIA operative by the name of Mr. B, real name Richard Bissell, would be flown to the location by Tony Levier. They all stood there in the desert, looked upon the wasteland they had landed on, and agreed that this is where the Aquatone aircraft would be tested, Johnson nicknaming the barren location Paradise Ranch. But you're probably more familiar with its now infamous moniker of Area 51. Despite an airfield reportedly existing on the lake circa 1942, the CIA would fully develop the area from basically nothing to a full airbase complete with hangars, a control tower, a fully paved runway, and copious amenities including a volleyball court and even a movie theater. By the time Article 341 was ready to fly, Area 51 was ready to begin the first of many test flights that would catapult the location into infamy. Shipped to Groom Lake in late July 1955, Article 341 entered the testing phase, and on August 2, 1955, during a taxi test, the aircraft would accidentally take flight for the first time, with test pilot Levier making a hasty landing that burst the tires and set fire to the brakes, though the aircraft was completely recovered. After some patchwork, 2 days later, Article 341 would complete its first scheduled flight slightly more successfully, though the landing still proved particularly difficult, with Levier almost running out of fuel and daylight before he was able to safely get the aircraft down, foreshadowing the eventual reputation the spyplane would gain as handling worse than a Gaz Volga. In fact, the landing procedure for the aircraft had been up for debate long before Levier made his little hop due to its odd bicycle landing gear, and some members of the Aquatone project believed the aircraft wouldn't even make it that far, expecting the big wings to just snap off during takeoff. Levier and Johnson would continue to argue about the landing even during the first flight, Johnson adamant that the aircraft should be landed on its front wheel first, and Levier vehemently dissenting that it should land on its back wheel first instead. Ben Rich notes this was one of the rare few times Johnson would be patently wrong during the development of an aircraft. Nonetheless, once the back wheel landing had been nailed down and some setbacks mainly involving the brakes and leaks in the engines had been resolved, flight testing proceeded smoothly, though Levier would be quickly replaced due to him being needed for other Lockheed test programs. Just a year after the approval of what was now termed the U-2, 4 aircraft were complete with another 5 under construction. CIA pilots had been sheep-dipped and trained on the aircraft, and Project Aquatone was almost ready to begin covertly tipping the scales of the ever-growing Cold War. It could fly, but could it survive a trip over the Soviet Union and make it back with critical reconnaissance? The first thing that needed to be established was the U-2's flight ceiling, because otherwise, well, what the fuck would be the point of the aircraft if it couldn't fly high enough to avoid Soviet interception? As flight testing continued into 1956, the high-altitude results came in. We know the commies could hit a maximum of around 45 to 50,000 feet, and as of 1955, the world altitude record was just shy of 66,000 feet, yet the U-2 was comfortably flying at 70,000 feet regularly in complete secrecy. And on June 1st, 1956, the U-2 would reach an altitude of 74,500 feet, a record that if made public would have stood unbeaten for nearly 2 years. Coupled with some engine adjustments including taping napkins to them to plug their seemingly never-ending leaks, the first mission-ready U-2s were deployed by the CIA to Wiesbaden in then West Germany, with their first flight over enemy territory commencing on June 19, 1956. Accompanied by a NASA with a C press release stating their high-altitude weather aircraft was operating in the region, wink wink, pilot Carl Overstreet took off for the Soviet bloc, and after a very tense few hours for the Eisenhower administration, he returned to Wiesbaden completely untouched, with 2 history-altering revelations. The first of which were the photographs captured of Soviet territory. The Type B camera developed by MIT's Dr. James Baker had taken photographs of incredible quality from 70,000 feet and were even better than the CIA had expected. But the second was that they had been detected from the moment the plane breached the Iron Curtain, and the Soviets had tried everything they could to down the intruder. But the bottom line was that the U-2 could fly over the Soviet Union and gather reconnaissance photographs with impunity. Now it was a matter of exploiting their edge before the Soviets could build something to stop them. Now, as much as I like to clown on the commies, the Soviets were not stupid. Well, at least in this case they weren't. They weren't buying that a high-altitude weather program from the West just happened to keep flying over their territory. And as the US began ramping up U-2 overflights in the summer of 1956, the Soviets would throw everything they had at the spy plane. Missiles, jets, missiles launched from jets. Hell, it wouldn't surprise me if some colonel on the ground was drunkenly firing a handgun at the damn thing. They tried it all, and in fact so determined were they to just shoot down the U-2s that MiGs trying to intercept them would reportedly collide and disintegrate on several occasions. But if there's one thing the Soviet Union was famous for, it's that they were deathly afraid of being embarrassed, and the U-2's ease of penetration without needing any lube had humiliated the commies. The Soviets demanded the US stop flying their very obviously not a high-altitude weather research plane over their territory, to which the US responded by claiming that no military aircraft had flown into Soviet airspace, something that was technically true as the U-2s were all operated by the CIA, a civilian agency. Eisenhower was shook though, and as much as he wanted to keep his steady supply of reconnaissance photography and look tough on communism for political brownie points, he wasn't about to risk a nuclear war if a U-2 got shot down, requiring all U-2 flyovers to be personally approved by the president's signature as of the end of the summer. Despite this political setback, in less than 2 years the U-2 had gone from an idea on a scrap of paper to the new cornerstone of American intelligence on the Soviet Union, and this would only continue. Between 1957 and 59, U-2 overflights gathered critical photographic data on the weapons programs once hidden behind the Iron Curtain, revealing the fallacy of the Soviet jet bomber threat, the lack of the widely theorized and fear-mongered missile gap in the Soviets' favor, and underscored that Soviet technology was not as advanced as they'd been leading the world to believe. Feeling bold as ever, the CIA used the U-2 to gather intelligence on the British and French during the many crises that erupted in the Middle East during the time, along with surveilling Red China as they began their own nuclear program, all the while being targeted and shot at to no avail. The U-2 was helping keep the Cold War, well, cold, but it was still only a matter of time before a U-2 was downed and the reconnaissance mission came to an end. And in May of 1960, when the CIA was hopelessly addicted to its supply of U-2 reconnaissance photographs, a series of innocuous oversights would lead to just that. By the time Francis Gary Powers flew out of Pakistan on May 1, 1960, Eisenhower had spent 3 years hesitantly approving U-2 missions over the Soviet Union. Yet, like a crackhead looking for one final fix, he kept approving them knowing that any problems would mean an international crisis. Coming just after Premier Khrushchev had visited the US, and days before a planned international summit, along with taking place on a Soviet holiday, the CIA sent Powers on the same route that had been flown by a U-2 just 3 weeks before, a route where the aircraft had been shot at almost constantly, but confident that he would complete his mission. Even if the rest of the Soviet Union was off their game that day, the missile batteries near Sverdlovsk were still on alert from the previous U-2 detection and were expecting another flyover. But now, they had something that could hit it. The S-75 Dvina missile, better known in the West as the SA-2. The US had actually been aware of this missile since 1958, and even knew some were operational in Sverdlovsk after then Vice President Nixon visited the region, but no one knew they could hit a U-2. Interestingly though, none of the new missiles actually hit Powers directly. 14 in total were fired at him, one supposedly hitting a MiG trying to intercept the spy plane, and the shockwaves combined from their detonations is what ended up sending Powers spiraling towards the Earth. Regardless of what downed him, the cat was out of the bag. The Soviets had their hands on undeniable proof of Western aggression, and even healed their ego a little by embarrassing Eisenhower on the world stage with the fiasco surrounding the attempted cover-up of the incident. The aircraft, designed to keep East-West tensions cool, had brought the world intensely close to nuclear conflict, and since even before it took to the skies for its first flight, the U-2 had been living on borrowed time. Now, after some typical American overconfidence, the clock had stopped. Yet it's been 60 years since the U-2's mission failed in dramatic fashion, and the spy plane still flies to this day. Now, obviously, the U-2 shootdown had a profound effect on the life of Francis Gary Powers and the U-2 itself, the former being later released in a prisoner swap with the West and working as a Lockheed test pilot for a number of years before retiring to work as a civilian helicopter pilot, dying as he lived in 1977. That is to say, he died in another aircraft crash, this time his news helicopter. For the latter, however, its life would essentially become kinda like the movie Groundhog Day. The U-2 would be deployed over a region that couldn't shoot it down, and operating until that region developed or bought the capability to, well, shoot it down. Then the CIA would move their operations to a new region that couldn't shoot it down, and the cycle continued. Operations over Soviet territory were off the table until something new could beat their air defenses, but nations such as Cuba, China, Korea, and Vietnam that had been recently infected with communism were very much still on the menu. And with the US government suffering reconnaissance withdrawal since the Powers shootdown, a fresh fix of photographs of other communist nations would do just fine. Flying certainly much more sporadically, the U-2 undeniably remained a cornerstone of the American reconnaissance gathering capabilities for the next decade. Its first major mission after May 1st, 1960 would be over China beginning in 1961, where U-2s captured images of their growing nuclear program that allowed the US to accurately predict the first Chinese nuclear detonation in 1964. The next would be over Cuba in mid-1962, where U-2s uncovered the damning evidence of a Soviet nuclear buildup that kicked off the Cuban Missile Crisis, along with surveilling the Caribbean commies throughout the ordeal. After this, the U-2 program was turned over from the CIA entirely to the Air Force, aside from the Chinese operations out of Taiwan, which would run until 1974. And as the Vietnam War ramped up in the mid-1960s, the Air Force activated the aircraft under Project Dragon Lady, spawning the now iconic name for the equally as iconic aircraft. Though by now, despite fully replacing the RB-57D as of 1964, the relevance of the U-2 was fading, especially clear after several more were shot down during missions. And with the operational introduction of the first Blackbirds as the 60s waned, the Dragon Lady would fly less and less. But there was no shortage of ideas for its continued use. Ever since the very obvious detection of the first operational flights over Soviet territory, Johnson and the Skunks had been working on ways to reduce the aircraft's RCS return, developing a number of ideas to do so under Project Rainbow, many of which should have had the entire plant put in a mental asylum for dreaming up. These included a chrome paint that would change colors like a chameleon, covering the entire aircraft in polka dots, taping long wires to the outside of the entire fuselage, and then pivoting to a slightly more reasonable liquid hydrogen-fueled variant to just outrun whatever the Soviets threw at them. Predictably, none of these really went anywhere with the U-2 program, but they would play a role in inspiring several developments during the creation of the A-12 and SR-71 Blackbirds, which would help them remain safe from hostile air defenses. Around the same time, the WU-2 was created for the Air Force's high-altitude sampling program as part of Operation Crowflight, which would become the most extensive study of nuclear material in the stratosphere. The U-2C would also emerge around this time too, equipped with the improved J-75 engine for greater altitude that would cost the aircraft some 300 miles in range. A carrier-launched version of the U-2 was developed in 1963, known as the U-2G, which was somewhat successful, managing to spy on French nuclear testing in the Pacific Ocean. The U-2R entered the picture in 1968, being a U-2 with a lengthened fuselage and larger wings, which would be deployed several times and itself would be improved with the TR-1, which had more sophisticated equipment, though this too would be encompassed under the U-2R name by 1992. Fortunately for anyone in the Air Force today, all operational U-2s are now known as the U-2S, following a major modernization program from Skunk Works in the 1990s, which included a transition from the increasingly unsupportable J-75 engine to the General Electric F-118. From the end of U-2 operations out of Taiwan in 1974 through until today, the U-2 has remained operational, now in its modernized U-2S form, and serves as a more direct and controllable alternative to reconnaissance satellites to gather reconnaissance data, serving in almost every conflict involving the US and its NATO allies since the start of the Cold War. And as if to come full circle, after using them as a cover for 15 years, NASA would get their hands on U-2s for scientific testing in 1971, which also persists to this day. When Project Aquatone was still in its infancy, the production aircraft was predicted to have 2 years maximum before it was obsolete. Yet despite the U-2 very quickly being vulnerable to interception, 104 were ultimately built until production ended 23 years after the Dragon Lady's first flight, and operations continue to the present day, with only 7 aircraft lost to enemy action since 1956 and some 30 aircraft still in use. Remember that Chinese spy balloon everyone lost their minds over? Here's a photo taken of it by a U-2 pilot before it was shot down. That's how indispensable the U-2 remains. It took a team of barely 100 Skunk Works personnel less than a year to create a spy plane that has now outlived not only nearly everyone that created it, but also the aircraft designed to replace it, the Blackbird, which was retired just before the 20th century came to a close. For a plane expected to be useless over 60 years ago, that's not half bad. Furthermore, 20% of that $54 million contract from the CIA was returned to the government, something considered rare then and completely unfathomable to anyone even remotely familiar with military procurement today. The U-2 was undeniably destined to fail. Those that created it knew its Soviet recon mission already had a foot in the grave from the get-go. Yet over half a century after these operations were terminated in dramatic fashion, the whole reason for its existence, the Dragon Lady still finds a way to take to the skies. Something I attribute to the passion for their aircraft possessed by all those at Skunk Works that drove them to push the boundaries with what the U-2 could achieve. Only time will tell what happens to the U-2. I'd love to say that its time left is limited, but its time passed over 60 years ago, and somehow it manages to prove its worth again and again, so I'm not even gonna bother jinxing myself. What I can say is that the history of the U-2 is truly fascinating, and I hope you've learned something new about one of the most unlikely legends in aviation lore. There is much more to this aircraft than what I've been able to cover here, from the creation of an entirely new fuel for the plane, to the numerous crashes that occurred during its life, and even the early countermeasure system suspected to have acted as a homing beacon for enemy missiles, among many, many others. And if you're interested in hearing about the smaller anecdotes surrounding the U-2, I might make some shorter videos covering them in the future. For now, if you're interested in learning more, I'll link the sources I used for this video below so you can check them out and read the astonishing story for yourselves. Thank you for watching, I hope you've enjoyed the tale of the Dragon Lady, and I'll see you all in the next one. Hello, welcome to the postscript of this video. As usual, I've got a couple of things to say, and if you're interested in the behind the scenes stuff, stick around. First off, if you enjoyed this video, leave a like and a comment. I've found that when the videos get more engagement, they tend to perform better in the long term, so for this video I've left a question that you can all respond to, and I'll be in there keeping the conversation going for the next couple of days. In addition, goddamn, this video was long. I won't lie, I thought this script would be like 20 minutes at most, including some little afterthoughts like this, not nearly 30. With that said, future videos are definitely not going to be coming weekly. As a single broke fella with no outside help and a bunch of responsibilities outside of this, it's just not going to happen, especially if I want to keep winning the tug of war in my brain against my crippling insanity. Now, the F-22 video will be coming next, with the first firearm video I've made in a while coming after, on the FG-42, and the part 2 to the war tier list coming sometime soon as well. I'd initially written a whole bunch more about stuff that I've been working on and the future of the channel, but this outro was meant to be quick, so I put the majority of that information in the community tab. Thank you again for watching, it really means the most, you guys are amazing, and I'll see you all later.